All right, now we're going to step back yet again for context and try to get the various players straight who were in place by the end of the decade. So we'll start with this guy, Everett M. Arnold, known by his nickname Busy Arnold, who was initially a salesman for printing presses. He went around to printing companies to sell them the actual equipment. Then later on, expanded beyond that and owned his own press, his own printing company. Okay, in 1936, Busy Arnold was approached by and agreed to invest in two guys who had contributed the previous year to Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's New Fun Comics, John Mahan and Bill Cook. They're wanting to get in on the action themselves, run their own company, and Arnold helps them get started. The Comics Magazine Company, it was called, and their first title was The Comics Magazine. And the cover there of issue 1, by the way, drawn by Vin Sullivan, who 2 years later would be the editor of the new Action Comics, who would meet with Sheldon Meyer and take Siegel and Schuster's Superman. All right, not long after that one came out, in May 1936, another title came out called Funny Picture Stories from the same company in November, and it featured a character called The Clock, created by George Brenner. Now, The Clock was just kind of a suave, debonair detective who happened to wear a black cloth over his face. Didn't make a huge splash, but nonetheless is significant because The Clock was therefore the very first character, the very first masked character designed specifically and exclusively for comic books, not for pulp magazines or comic strips. The first all-original comic book masked person. By 1938, the Comics Magazine Company had morphed into Centaur Publications, which was only around for a few years. It was initially under the editorial control of Lloyd Jacquet, or Lloyd Jacquet. He was the son of a French immigrant. Lloyd Jacquet had been the editor of Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's New Fun and More Fun Comics for the first several issues. So now he's over at what has become Centaur Publications, and working with artist Bill Everett, introduced Amazing Men. Now, Bill Everett created the character. Jacquet may have had some input into it. Everett, you will recall, we've mentioned once before already, as the creator of Prince Namor, the Submariner, which was actually just a month or two after the debut of Amazing Men. You see, Jacquet had left Centaur not very long after landing there, and founded Funnies Incorporated, which was a comic book syndicate, making this the third such syndicate in existence. Remember, there was the Eisner and Iger studio, and there was also one called the Harry A. Chesler studio, we'll mention briefly later. So Everett went with Jacquet into Funnies Incorporated, and from there wound up on the ground floor providing material for Marvel Comics #1. Busy Arnold, meanwhile, decided he wanted to get involved directly in on the act instead of investing in someone else. So, 1937, he established Comic Favorites Incorporated, which released their first title, Feature Funnies, in October 1937, which featured reprints of a comic strip called Lollapalooza by Rube Goldberg. Maybe you've heard that name before, even if you're not familiar with comics. Rube Goldberg was a cartoonist who was famous, most famous really, even today, 100 years later, for his very elaborate, nonsensical yet functional machines that he designed. Also, an animator in which he did little cartoon shorts featuring such machines. In fact, he produced a film short about one of his machines that featured the debut of a comedy team in 1930 called the Three Stooges. So Rube Goldberg, that's his connection to the comic book business. A couple of years later, Arnold bought out some competitors and expanded and sort of refocused, and Comics Favorites Incorporated became Comics Magazines Incorporated, not to be confused with the Comics Magazine Company, which later became Centaur. No, this is Comic Magazines Incorporated, which would quickly become known as Quality Comics. So, long story short, Quality Comics. That's another imprint that shows up, another publisher in 1939. Busy Arnold is the owner. George Brenner, the guy who had created The Clock, is brought over to be the editor and art director. And most of their artwork is subcontracted through Eisner and Eiger Studios. In fact, Eisner himself did quite a bit of it, and that's going to lead to a major change for Eisner. Busy Arnold offered Will Eisner a very lucrative deal to come over to Quality Comics full time. It was an understanding that they came to that Eisner later described as Eisner having interpreted it that he was going to be a partner, and Arnold having interpreted it that he was going to be gaining an employee. But however you look at it, Eisner did in fact leave Eisner and Eiger Studios in 1940 and go over to Quality Comics, leaving Jerry Eiger solely in charge of that comic book art syndicate, which was changed to S.M. Eiger rather than Eisner and Eiger. So Eisner comes over, and now he is he's doing the artwork for several of the Quality publications. And Arnold decides to expand yet again in a new direction. Now, a lot of comic strip syndicates had taken note of the sudden, seemingly overnight explosion of popularity of comic books, particularly comic books with masked heroes or superheroes, and were wanting to get some of that action in the newspapers. So what Arnold basically talked Eisner into trying, and was then able to get contracts for, was for Eisner to create an all-new character, a masked character, who would appear in the Sunday papers in the funnies section in a special extra supplement. The character was called The Spirit, and was a huge hit. Very good showcase for Eisner's talents, which were a lot more complex, a lot more sophisticated than the average comic strip or comic book artist of the time. A very noir feel to it. And you can see there on the right, there's what the front cover looked like. It was basically a newspaper supplement, this one in the Chicago Sun. Also, the newspaper strips would then be reprinted in the pages of quality comic books such as Smash or The Spirit. So you had both things going on at once, and this is where Eisner really became nationally known beyond just within the circle of comic books. Got a lot of exposure. So by 1940, comic book companies either had their own pool of talent on staff, such as National/Detective Comics did, and Timely/Marvel, or they contracted the artwork and stories and the whole thing really through one of these three comic book syndicates: S.M. Eiger, Harry A. Chesler. The A is in quotation marks because he didn't actually have a middle initial, and so he said A stands for anything. Really colorful guy. And Funnies Incorporated. By the way, after hearing the names of Eisner and Eiger so frequently these last couple of lectures, you might have found them to be somewhat familiar, and you might wonder if there's a connection between Will Eisner and Jerry Eiger and Michael Eisner and Bob Iger, who between the two of them have run Walt Disney Studios for the last 20 or 30 years. Well, the answer is no and yes. Michael Eisner is not related to Will Eisner, but Bob Iger is in fact the great-nephew of Jerry Eiger of the S.M. Eiger comic book studio. It occurs to me that at this point I should probably explain some of the terminology rather than just assuming that you know what it all means. I've already mentioned a couple of things that may have left you puzzled, like, what's the difference between an artist and an inker? So let's talk about that real quickly. The writer, obviously, writes the story, also called the scripter. And sometimes, most of the time, there is a literal script involved that is provided to the artist. Sometimes, most of the time probably, the writer would actually type out a script just like for a screenplay or something, where panel by panel they would not only have the dialogue that they intended to be in that panel, but also a description of what was supposed to be happening that the artist would be expected to follow, especially in the Golden Age way of doing things. Sometimes, if a writer had some artistic sensibilities, they might go a step farther than that and do some really basic layouts, panel by panel, of roughly what they were hoping to end up with from the artist. Now, you didn't have to be the world's greatest artist to, as a writer, do these kinds of breakdowns. And this varied from company to company and from individual to individual. But obviously, the more detail the writer gives, the less control the artist is going to have. So some companies tended to be sort of writer-centric. Others later would be more artist-centric. And there's going to be a totally and completely different way of doing this that develops that we'll talk about much later on. The artist or penciler then draws out the script prepared by the writer. They do it in pencil, usually without extreme amounts of detail. And again, this varies from artist to artist. Some do more detail in their pencils than others. After the penciler has had their go at it and basically provided the framework, the pages are then sent over to the inker or the finisher, who will go over the lines that the penciler has put down in ink and fill in all the details so that you have this finished product. Now, sometimes they're referred to as the penciler, or sometimes as the artist and the inker. So the artist you assume to be the person doing the pencils, and sometimes it's referred to as pencils and inks. Some artists do their own inks, both back in the Golden Age and still today. For example, on the left, you have a page from the Fantastic Four in which the Canadian penciler John Byrne has inked his own pencils. On the right is a page from the Uncanny X-Men where John Byrne's pencils have been inked by Terry Austin. Now you can look at both these and from the style clearly tell that it's the work of John Byrne. But they are different, and I wouldn't even say that the differences are subtle. There's the kind of the heavier, cleaner line work on the right, and also a lot of Austin just kind of shows through. So you have this hybrid of the two of them, and it can make a big difference. The colorist, of course, provides the color. And for the last 30 plus years, that process has been done by means of computer, which has enabled a lot of subtleties in shading and so forth that weren't really possible before. But from the 1930s to the 1980s, it was done the old-fashioned way, and it really was a very detailed approach that required quite a bit of skill. So essentially what the colorist would do is they would make photocopies of the finished inked art. Then they would transfer those photocopies onto a cellophane film, and then they would cut out various pieces representing different colors and arrange them and mark them for the printer. They would mark them using the CMYK code system, and you can see the 1982 DC version of that. Those are for the colors cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And as you take each of these cellophane films and lay one on top of the other, by the time you've done the fourth one, the black one, then you have the completed product. This is why comic books were often referred to as four-color comics, because essentially everything could be broken down into those four colors. Now that did limit the palette that was available. However, once everything is all laid out and sort of pasted back together and ready to send to the printers, the printers would then on the page, which from the 1930s to the 1980s was usually a little bit better than pulp, but not quite as good as a slick magazine. The colors would be transferred by means of a series of tiny dots and lines. Again, much different today, as demonstrated in these amazing Spider-Man panels from the year 2020. The job of letterer, too, done by computers nowadays, for the longest time, however, was done by hand. And the letterer is the person who comes along on the finished artwork and provides text and sound effects, and that includes drawing by hand the words, but also the word balloons and speech bubbles, thought bubbles, etc. In fact, in the old days, they would actually cut those out and paste them onto the photocopies of the artwork to go to the printer. So in the early days, when you had, for example, Siegel and Schuster doing a 13-page strip, the two of them would do all that stuff. However, by the late 30s and certainly by 1940, when you've got all these comic book syndicates out there, these studios, and you've got house talent and so forth, then you've got more of an assembly line process, and you've got people who are beginning to specialize in just doing the colors or just doing the letters. And it reached a point with the growing popularity of comics in the 1940s that as an artist, you could make, you couldn't make much of a living total in comic books for the most part. It didn't pay real well, but you could make a living specializing, for example, as just being a letterer. Well, now let's check back in on National Publications / Detective Comics, the ones who got the ball rolling with superheroes and with the extraordinary popularity all of a sudden of comic books, with Action Comics #1 with Superman 1938. Well, 1939, they expand and Superman gets a second title called Superman. So, from then on, Superman was appearing regularly in 2 books per month, his own and still in Action Comics. Over in Detective Comics, the also extraordinarily popular Batman was given a sidekick in April of 1940. Robin the Boy Wonder, brightly garbed circus acrobat who fits in real well with a dark and mysterious figure of the night. Right after Robin's debut, Batman also received a second title named Batman. So he also is going to be appearing in both Batman and Detective Comics. Now, that was true in 1940, and it has been true ever since. Superman has appeared regularly in both Superman and Action, and Batman has appeared in both Batman and Detective Comics, and that still continues to be the case. Now, in that very first issue of Batman, we met the Joker, one of the all-time great comic villains. Robin and the Joker, despite the fact that it says Bob Kane in big letters, essentially created by Bill Finger. $130. That, you will remember, is what Siegel and Schuster were paid for that first 13-page Superman story that appeared in Action Comics #1. Now, they got the headliner in the comic book, and the comic was a huge success and sold like crazy, and as a result, their page rate went up significantly. Plus, they got the gig doing the daily comic strip, which paid better than the comic book itself did. So, from their perspective, at the time, they were making out pretty well. However, they would come to revisit that initial transaction pretty quickly, because in 1940, National Comics applied for and received a trademark for Superman. Not just a copyright, okay? The trademark was Superman DC Comics. And every subsequent issue of Action and Superman would say Superman DC Comics on it. there's a distinction between copyright and trademark. Copyright would mean that they had copyrighted a work of fiction that this character appeared in, and they might even say that they had copyrighted the character. But a trademark means it's not just a work of fiction; it is a business asset. Intellectual property is what they would call it today. So what that means is that not only does DC have the right to, get the royalties from the sales, from the appearances of the fictional hero, they own the property, which means they could do whatever they want to with it, including licensing it out to other businesses as a product, not as a mascot, but as a product, which is different from what, for example, had happened with Richard Outcault's Buster Brown, that he was able to license out to the shoe company, and yet he still owned the character, right? Siegel and Schuster are not going to see one dime of the money that's going to come through Superman to DC Comics beyond the printed page. And even on the printed page, they're only going to get what they're paid for their work for any particular story. They don't have residuals. They don't have royalties. And Superman has, again, almost overnight, become a phenomenal pop culture event, really. In 1940, Superman became a radio program. Siegel and Schuster didn't make any money off that. DC made money off of the sponsorship of that. Kellogg's was the main sponsor. And really the popularity of Superman grew even more and expanded beyond its audience of adolescent boys, because a lot more people listened to the radio than read comic books. In fact, it was the radio program, not the comic book, that introduced this monologue as its introduction. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. Yes, Superman, strange visitor from another planet. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, and who, disguised as Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a major metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. So that was 1940. By the next year, Superman was appearing in cartoons from the Max Fleischer animation studio. Very well-made cartoons, in fact. Leagues ahead of a lot of the stuff that was being released in animation shorts in theaters at that time. Well, radio, cartoons, movie theaters, Kellogg's, a balloon at the Macy's Day Parade. All these things were adding up to a significant amount of money for Donenfeld and Leibowitz. And Siegel and Schuster were starting to question just how much truth, justice, and the American way they had been beneficiaries of.